You know that feeling, right? Just staring at this mountain of information reports, charts, emails, articles, everything piling up.
Oh, absolutely. Information overload is definitely a real thing.
And then on top of that, you've got to somehow process it all and, explain it clearly to someone else, maybe in a report, maybe an email, maybe just talking it through.
It's a huge challenge. We're just bombarded with data, with different kinds of messages all day long.
Exactly. And knowing how to cut through that, figure out what actually matters, and then communicate that effectively. Well, that's becoming such a core skill, isn't it?
It really is. Whether you're a student, a professional, really anyone who needs to understand and share information.
Which is precisely what we're diving into today. We've gathered a whole collection of source materials, things like guides, sample answers, instructions, all focusing on different ways we communicate in writing, things like describing data, building arguments in essays, even writing practical letters.
So the idea is to sort of unpack what these sources tell us about doing that well.
Exactly. Our mission here is to give you a shortcut, really. We'll pull out the key strategies, the language tools, the structures these documents highlight for presenting information, analyzing it, arguing a point.
Or just crafting a clear message. It's about looking at how these sources break down the process.
Yeah, we'll look at suggested structures, specific vocabulary, some really useful stuff in there, and walk through some of the examples they provide.
So what kind of sources are we actually looking at?
It's a mix. We've got guides specifically on describing visuals, charts, graphs, tables, maps, process diagrams, lots on that.
Okay.
Then there are examples and instructions for different kinds of essays, opinion essays, discussion essays, that sort of thing.
Right, where you have to argue a point or explore different views.
And also some very practical examples of letters for different situations. What's interesting is that they all offer a kind of structured way to think about writing and understanding these different text types.
So it's less about some kind of magical writing talent and more about understanding the task and using the right tools and structures for the job.
Precisely. It's about method. Okay, so let's start with that first big chunk. Describing visual data. This is something loads of us have to do. Look at a chart or a graph and explain what it shows.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Reports, presentations, news articles.
And the sources really dig into how to do this effectively. They cover all sorts. Bar charts, line graphs, pie charts, tables, even diagrams showing a process or changes on a map, sometimes even multiple graphs together.
And the main goal here, according to these materials, isn't just to read out the numbers.
No, definitely not. The sources emphasize that your task is usually to summarize the key information. That means selecting the main features, the most important trends, the biggest differences, the highs and lows.
And making relevant comparisons. So not just what happened, but how it compares to something else on the chart or another time period.
Spotting the main story, basically.
Exactly. And there's a really strict rule that comes up again and again in these guides.
Ah, yes, the big one.
You have to use only the information provided in the visual, no outside knowledge, no speculation about why things happened, and absolutely no personal opinions.
That's such a key constraint. It forces you into this mode of pure objective reporting. You're like a translator, turning the visual into words, but adding nothing of your own.
Precisely. Your job is just to report what the data shows, not why you think it shows that.
So, given that constraint, how do the sources suggest structuring this kind of report? Say, for a university lecture, as some examples mentioned.
Well, there's a pretty standard structure they lay out. You start with an introduction.
Yeah, what goes in there?
Two main things. First, you define what the visual is actually about, what it shows, the location, the time period, what variables are being measured, just setting the scene.
Got it.
Then, usually in the same introductory paragraph, you give a general overview or a summary statement. This is where you state the main trend or the most striking feature you see across the whole graphic, kind of the headline finding.
So, introduce the what's, then give the main takeaway right at the start. Some sources mention paraphrasing the task description itself as a way to begin.
Yeah, that can be a good starting point for defining the what.
Okay, intro done. Then the body paragraphs.
That's where you flesh out the details. You elaborate on those main features you identified in the overview and provide the specific data and comparisons to support them.
And how do you organize those details?
Logically, if the data tracks changes over time, like a line graph, organizing chronologically makes sense. Start at the beginning and describe the progression.
Right.
If it's comparing different categories, maybe like a bar chart showing different countries, you might group your points thematically, perhaps discussing the highest and lowest, or grouping countries with similar patterns.
So choose an organization that makes the information easy to follow. What about a conclusion? Do you need a separate summary at the end?
It's interesting. Some guides mention a brief concluding summary. But honestly, many of the actual sample answers provided in the sources don't have a distinct conclusion section. Yeah, they tend to put that main summary or overview right up front in the introduction, as we said. The body paragraphs then just provide the detailed evidence. So the key seems to be having that clear overview statement, usually at the beginning, rather than necessarily needing a separate concluding paragraph repeating it.
Okay, so the structure is intro with definition and overview, followed by body paragraphs detailing the main features and comparisons logically.
That seems to be the core model presented.
Now, this all sounds logical, but where I think the sources get really practical and, honestly, quite powerful is when they dive into the specific language to use.
Oh, absolutely. This is crucial for achieving that precision and objectivity. They provide a whole toolkit of vocabulary.
Yeah, like for describing change, for things going up.
You've got verbs like rise, increase, grow, climb. For more dramatic increases, boom or surge, and peak for reaching the highest point. And of course, go up.
And for things going down?
Fall, drop, decline, decrease, dip,
Mm-hmm.
maybe slump or plummet for sharp falls.
And they show how to use the noun forms too, right? Like a rise, an increase, a fall, a drop.
Exactly. So you can say the number of users increased or there was an increase in the number of users. Gives you flexibility.
And then you layer on words to describe how the change happened, the speed or the degree.
Yes. Adverbs and adjectives are key here. For the degree of change. Dramatically, sharply, enormously, steeply, substantially, considerably, significantly, markedly. Or for smaller changes, slightly marginally.
And for the speed.
Words like rapidly, quickly, swiftly for fast changes, and gradually, steadily, slowly for slower ones.
So you combine these. Instead of just sales went up, you can be much more precise, like sales rose sharply, or there was a gradual increase in sales.
Precisely. It allows your description to mirror the visual information much more accurately. It adds that layer of detail and nuance.
And speaking of accuracy, the sources really zero in on prepositions when you're citing specific numbers. This seems like a small thing, but they make a big deal of it.
It is a big deal. Using the wrong preposition can completely change the meaning. They highlight several key ones.
Like to. When do you use to?
You use to indicate the final point reached after a change. So profits rose to $10 million. That means $10 million was the end point.
Okay. And by.
By describes the amount or margin of change. Profits rose by $2 million. That tells you the size of the increase, not the final figure.
Big difference. What about with?
With is often used to show possession of a number or percentage, like the party won the election with 52% of the vote.
Right. And at?
At is used to specify a level or point, often at the end of a sentence, or for peaks and troughs. Inflation peaked at 5%, or the rate stood at 10% in June.
Okay. And for time periods?
Use in for specific years or months, like in 2023, and for ranges. For ranges, like sales grew between 2020 and 2022.
Got it. One more of?
Of is often used to link a number or amount to what it refers to, like a fall of 20% or a majority of 15 seats at the level of unemployment.
Wow, okay. It really shows how much meaning is packed into those tiny words. Getting them right is essential for accurately reporting those figures.
Absolutely fundamental. It's the bedrock of precise data description.
The sources, thankfully, give us plenty of examples to see this in action. I was looking at the one describing prisoner numbers in different countries.
Ah, yes, that's a good example.
It follows that structure we talked about. Intro sets the scene comparing 5 countries over a specific period. Then it identifies main features.
Right, like pointing out the U.S. had the highest figures overall, Great Britain generally the lowest. It makes those key comparisons up front.
And uses that specific language. It mentions numbers rose steadily in Great Britain and the U.S. figures reaching a peak at a certain point. It talks about fluctuations in New Zealand and Australia.
It's selecting the most significant trends and using that precise vocabulary, steadily peak fluctuations to describe them, making comparisons between the countries. It's not just a data dump.
No, it tells a story based on the visual. Another good one was the cell phone subscribers example.
Yeah, that one's great for showing how to use those adverbs and adjectives for degree.
Right. It distinguishes between things that rose significantly, those that increased considerably, and others that only rose slightly.
It also shows how you'd state that something didn't change, remained stable, or there was no change, indicating a plateau. It captures those finer distinctions shown in the graph.
We see similar language in the school enrollment example, too. Rose steadily, small increase, rise more rapidly. And the ticket sales one highlights peaks, highest sales times, and describes changes like started out relatively low, then rose.
Yeah, and the digital games one notes rises each year, a significant rise in total turnover, and makes comparisons like handheld sales being twice as high as console sales at one point.
The waste recycling example uses phrases like threefold increase and notes the rate of increase changing becoming less dramatic. It compares the percentage recycled versus the total collected.
And the house prices one focuses purely on comparing costs across different cities over the time period shown, all using that targeted language.
So, for charts and graphs showing trends and numbers, it's all about that structure, selecting main features, making comparisons, and using precise vocabulary for change, degree, speed, and numbers.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
But the sources also cover describing other kinds of visuals, like process diagrams.
Right, like the one showing how frozen orange juice concentrate is made. That requires a different approach, doesn't it?
Completely different.
Mm-hmm.
Here, you're not talking about trends or numbers changing over time. You're describing a sequence of steps or stages.
So the language has to change.
Exactly. You rely heavily on sequence words. First, next, then, after that, following this, finally, and so on to guide the reader through the process.
And the verb tense.
This is key.
Yeah.
You use the present simple tense. Even though you're describing a general process, you use the present simple, like the oranges are washed, the juice is extracted.
Okay, sequence words and present simple. And I noticed the orange juice example uses a lot of passive voice. Oranges are picked, they are transported, juice is extracted. Why is that?
Good question. The passive voice is very common when describing processes, especially manufacturing ones. It's used because the focus is on the action being performed and the object receiving the action, the oranges, the juice, not on who or what is doing the action.
So it doesn't matter who washes the oranges, just that they're washed as part of the process.
Precisely. It keeps the focus squarely on the steps shown in the diagram.
So for processes, sequence language presents simple tense, often passive voice, just walking through the stages.
It's the formula.
What about diagrams showing changes, like before and after pictures? The sources had examples like a library renovation or changes to a river area.
Yet for those, the focus shifts again. You're not describing a sequence or trends over time. You're highlighting the differences between the before state and the after state.
So you describe what was there initially and then specifically point out what changed, what was added, removed, or altered.
Exactly. Your language needs to focus on describing those transformations. The library was extended, a new cafe was added, the trees along the riverbank were removed, flood barriers were constructed. You're pinpointing the changes.
Okay, so that covers the main types of visuals. It really is about understanding the type of visual and tailoring your structure and language accordingly. Trends and comparisons for graphs, sequence for processes, and changes for before and after diagrams.
It provides a clear framework for tackling these tasks objectively and accurately.
Right. Let's switch gears now. From objective description to the world of essays. This is where things like analysis, argument, and often opinion come into play. A very different beast.
Definitely. The sources we looked at cover several common essay types you might encounter, especially in academic or testing contexts.
Like what?
Well, there are prompts that ask you to discuss both views and give your own opinion, or ones that ask, to what extent do you agree or disagree? Sometimes it's about discussing advantages and disadvantages, or whether something is a positive or negative development.
And problem solution types, too.
Yeah, what are the reasons for X? How can you solve it? Those kinds of questions.
Okay, so different prompts. But is there a general structure the sources recommend for essays?
Yes, there's a fairly consistent structure suggested. It usually involves an introduction.
What does that do?
It should introduce the general topic, often by paraphrasing the question, and then clearly state your position or outline how you plan to approach the topic in the essay. Sort of a roadmap.
Makes sense. Then the main part.
The body paragraphs. Usually aiming for around 3 or 4 body paragraphs, maybe 4 or 5 paragraphs total, including intro and conclusion. Each body paragraph should focus on one main idea or argument.
One idea per paragraph.
Right. And you need to develop that idea with supporting details, explanations, and crucially, examples. Examples really help make your points concrete and convincing.
And finally,
A conclusion. This should summarize your main points briefly and restate your overall position or offer a final thought on the topic. It shouldn't introduce brand new ideas.
so intro, body paragraphs with main ideas and support, conclusion. Pretty standard essay format. The sources also mention practical things like length and timing.
They do. For tasks like IELTS Writing Task 2, which these resemble, they often specify a minimum word count, like 250 words. The optimal length is often suggested to be around 260, 280 words, and they typically recommend allocating about 40 minutes for planning and writing the essay.
Okay. Beyond the basic structure, what are the key principles the sources highlight for writing a good essay?
Planning comes up repeatedly. Taking a few minutes to brainstorm ideas and outline your structure before you start writing is crucial. Don't just dive in.
Good advice. What else?
Varying your sentence structure. Using a mix of simple, compound, and complex sentences makes the writing more engaging and sophisticated. Avoid just using short, choppy sentences all the time, or only long, rambling ones.
And linking ideas together. That must be important for arguments.
Absolutely vital. Cohesion and coherence are key assessment criteria mentioned. Using transition words and phrases effectively is essential to guide the reader smoothly through your argument.
What kind of linking words do they mention?
Lots of examples come up in the practice exercises and samples. Words like firstly, secondly, finally for sequencing points. Moreover, furthermore, in addition, what is more for adding related ideas. However, on the other hand, in contrast for showing contrast. Therefore, as a result, consequently for showing results. Because due to for reasons, for example, for instance, such as for giving examples, although while for concessions. And phrases like, in my opinion, if you're asked for it.
Wow, quite a list. So using those appropriately helps the logic flow.
Definitely. And vocabulary is another big one. Using a good range of vocabulary accurately and appropriately, avoiding repetition, choosing precise words is important.
And basic accuracy, spelling, grammar.
Foundational. Errors in spelling, punctuation, or grammar can obscure your meaning and lower the overall quality. The sources mention checklists that specifically include checking for accuracy.
Now, one really interesting point the sources make, especially compared to the data description task, is about the ideas themselves in the essay.
Yes, this is quite freeing, actually. They explicitly state that you don't necessarily need to have incredibly unique or brilliant ideas.
Really?
Yeah. What matters more is that your ideas are logical, relevant to the question, and this is the crucial part, that you can support them convincingly with reasons and examples. It's more about the quality of your argumentation than the originality of your viewpoint.
So it's about how you argue, not necessarily what profound insight you have.
Exactly. Can you build a coherent case? Can you back up your claims? That's the focus.
That takes some pressure off. So the sources provide a lot of sample essays on different topics. Instead of trying to cover every single one, maybe we could look at the types of arguments and viewpoints presented in a few, just to see how they apply these principles. Remembering, of course, we're just reporting what the sources present, not endorsing any views.
Good idea. We can see the structures and argumentation styles in action. For example, there are essays tackling social issues. One discusses whether parents give children less attention today compared to the past.
How does it handle that?
It presents arguments on both sides. The less attention now side points to mothers often working today, whereas maybe they stayed home more in the past. But the counter-argument in the sample suggests parents in the past often worked very long hours too. Maybe children work less now. And schools play a bigger role in noticing issues. It weighs these points.
So a balanced discussion structure. What about topics like multinational companies?
One sample argues they can be harmful, potentially reducing product choice or forcing local businesses out. It also raises the concern about cultural diversity, suggesting we end up shopping in similar places and buying identical products globally. That's the viewpoint presented there.
Okay. And working from home or teleworking?
A sample on that lays out clear advantages and disadvantages. Advantages include reduced costs for employers, less commuting, and more flexibility for employees. Disadvantages mentioned are things like missing the social interaction of the office, potential trust issues, and challenges in supervision.
A classic pros and cons structure. What about studying abroad?
Similar approach. Advantages noted in a sample include access to better facilities or courses not available at home. Drawbacks mentioned are personal ones, like leaving family, and practical ones, like higher costs or the difficulty of studying in a foreign language. That sample even uses a gap fill exercise to highlight transition words connecting these points.
Showing the importance of those linking words again. Let's see, energy sources. That's always a big topic.
There's a sample discussing the reliance on fossil fuels versus alternatives like wind, solar, and nuclear. It notes the pollution issue with fossil fuels and the benefits of renewables being non-polluting and everlasting. Nuclear is mentioned as clean and powerful, citing France as an example.
Does it take a side?
It presents the debate, even mentioning the wind turbines are eyesores argument and the counter-argument that they can be seen as useful or even beautiful.
Yeah.
It lays out the different perspectives.
Okay. Another one was about building a factory near a community.
Right. That sample acknowledges the advantage of job creation, but argues strongly that the disadvantages pollution, environmental damage, health risks outweigh the benefits. So that particular sample takes a clear stance opposing the factory based on those risks.
Interesting. What about reasons for going to university?
A sample explores several reasons. Career preparation in a competitive market, gaining new experiences like meeting diverse people and living independently, and simply increasing knowledge in interesting subjects. Interestingly, that sample suggests not focusing too much on career, valuing the broader experience and self-discovery aspects as well.
A more holistic view. Children's health came up too.
Yes, a sample discusses deteriorating health due to factors like more processed food and fast food, less physical exercise, partly due to exam focus in schools, and less walking cycling, and more indoor time with screens. The solution proposed in that sample is a return to more traditional ways of eating and living.
A clear problem-cause-solution structure there. What about media influence?
A sample weighs the pros and cons. Advantages mentioned include easy communication, staying informed, entertainment, and the choice and immediacy offered by new media. Disadvantages cited include feeling disconnected without devices, less face-to-face interaction, potential for poor quality content due to too much choice, and excessive advertising. The sample concludes that survival in a media-rich world means being aware of its power and not letting it control you.
A nuanced take. International tourism causing tension.
There's a sample that largely agrees with this idea. It argues short trips don't guarantee understanding, cultural differences can be misinterpreted, and tourists can be vulnerable or act offensively. It also mentions potential resentment from locals due to wealth differences or perceived threats to their way of life. It uses Bali as an example of tourists being hassled.
So it presents arguments supporting the pension premise. What about theoretical versus practical learning at university?
A sample contrasts them. Theoretical is described as traditional, good for established knowledge, but potentially tedious. Practical learning is presented as stimulating interest through research, learning by doing, and better for knowledge acquisition. That specific sample concludes by stating a belief that the practical approach is better for future generations.
So that one clearly expresses a preference. Impact of computers.
A sample strongly agrees they've made life easier. It lists numerous examples: data storage for companies, faster banking, easier document creation, communication via the internet, making the world smaller, online shopping. It concludes computers have changed attitudes and brought people closer.
A very positive assessment in that sample. Countryside versus city for raising kids.
That sample presents arguments for both. Countryside, healthier environment, more exercise, maybe more parental time due to less traffic. City, more opportunities, cultural, sports, better preparation for the real world, more entertainment, better services like healthcare, citing a specific anecdote. And that sample explicitly states, I agree with those people who want to raise their children in a city, favoring the city argument.
Explicit opinion stated there. Planning free time.
One sample contrasts the benefits of not planning, relaxation, spontaneity, stress reduction, with the benefits of planning, ensuring you do what you want, needed for things like travel or booking facilities. That particular sample concludes by stating a preference for planning free time.
Interesting how these samples show different ways opinions can be integrated or stated. Media violence in youth.
One sample tackles the statement that media violence increases societal violence by saying this link cannot be quantified or proved. Another sample, however, argues against media violence, suggesting young people imitate it, it's glamorized, and it desensitizes people. That second one proposes checking violence in media as a solution, shows different angles on the same topic within the sources.
Yeah. The waste problem.
A sample identifies causes like our materialistic, high-consumption lifestyle and lack of landfill space. Solutions proposed involve shared responsibility. Individuals producing less waste, e.g. using own bags, governments enforcing laws on companies, e.g. biodegradable packaging, and companies developing recyclable materials.
A multi-pronged solution. Cars versus public transport.
A sample addresses problems with cars, traffic pollution, and discusses how governments could encourage public transport. The suggestions include making driving expensive, tolls, parking fees are inconvenient, but also positive measures like free parking at stations and making public transport itself better. That sample argues the advantages of public transport outweigh the cons of private cars.
Retirement age.
There's a sample arguing against mandatory retirement based solely on age. It presents reasons like age not being a true indicator of ability, performance being key, the economic sense of retaining experienced employees, and increasing life expectancies, meaning people need income longer. It suggests mandatory retirement strains government finances, too.
A clear argument against age-based retirement there? Crime by teenagers.
One sample explores reasons like media influence, lack of quality time with parents or broken families, peer pressure, lack of values, unemployment, and lack of parental monitoring. Solutions suggested involve cooperation between government, parents, teachers, parents giving quality time, limiting screen time, encouraging outdoor activities, stricter laws, compulsory education, and addressing youth unemployment.
A complex issue with multiple factors and solutions presented. Cycling popularity.
A sample discusses why it might not be popular, time-consuming, lack of environmental concern, and suggests ways to increase it, like government initiatives, like green days, media promotion, and optional training.
Okay. What about zoos? That can be controversial.
Yes, one source just lists it as a topic. Another source, however, presents a sample answer that takes a very strong stance against zoos. It explicitly states, "I can see no good reason for the existence of zoos," arguing it's cruel to keep animals caged and not the best way to research them. So that sample presents a very clear, one-sided opinion from the source material.
Right, just reporting that specific view from the source. University fees, who should pay?
Sources mention the debate. Students benefit personally, so they should pay, versus society benefits, so the government should pay. One sample answer presents a compromise. Government could partially fund basic education, but individuals should pay for advanced studies.
A middle ground approach. Imported versus local food.
A source raises the question of why people buy imported, globalization, tastes, and asks how to encourage local food buying. But the sample answer itself wasn't provided in the material we have, so we just know the topic was raised.
Okay. Working in multinational companies and understanding culture.
A sample disagrees that this is the best way to understand other cultures, even while acknowledging some knowledge might be gained. So a nuanced disagreement there.
Learning a second language.
Samples strongly support this, especially starting in primary school. Benefits mentioned include improved communication, cultural awareness, confidence, better travel experiences, and cognitive benefits like increased brain power. The samples link language learning directly to cognitive development.
High pay for executives.
A sample argues against very high executive pay. It contrasts it with other professions like civil servants or judges who don't have the same performance-related pay culture. It argues for fairer pay for a happier society and suggests firms can be socially responsible by restricting pay while still getting results.
A critique of executive pay culture in that sample. Saving endangered languages.
A sample presents both sides. Arguments for saving include preserving culture and diversity. Arguments against mention the difficulty, the right of speakers to shift languages, and the potential waste of resources. That particular sample leans against trying to save dying languages, citing the practical challenges and individual choice.
A pragmatic, though perhaps controversial, viewpoint presented there. Sports and success, does the strongest always win?
That's raised as a debate topic in one source, but again, no sample answer was provided to show the arguments.
Responsible tourism. Should tourists care about the destination?
A sample argues strongly yes. It says it's everyone's responsibility, not just the industries. It uses examples like tourists over-consuming resources, Shimla, or needing to respect local culture to avoid hostility, Sukna Lake. The sample concludes tourists should be responsible.
Using specific examples to bolster the argument. Mobile phones and face-to-face communication.
A sample addresses the idea that people are losing the ability to communicate face-to-face. Interestingly, this sample disagrees that the ability itself is lost, even while acknowledging less in-person communication happens.
Public spaces like parks.
A sample strongly supports their importance. Reasons given include relaxation, physical activity, social interaction, breaking down barriers, providing green space, lungs of cities, creating neighborhood identity, attracting tourists, and boosting the economy, citing famous squares as examples.
Okay. Environmental protection, especially regarding fossil fuels in remote areas.
This one is complex in the sources. One sample answer argues that the pros of tapping these resources, like significant income, outweigh the cons, even acknowledging damage to natural areas. However, the outline notes for that same sample seem to lean the other way, listing cons like expensive transport, accident risks, contribution to global warming, and advocating for renewables.
So the source material itself shows some tension or conflicting points on that topic.
Exactly. The model answer argues for tapping, but the surrounding notes highlight strong counterarguments. We report both aspects as presented.
Community work for young people, should it be paid?
A sample discusses this, arguing for paying youngsters for voluntary work. Reasons given include it being a win-win for the community and the youth, potentially reducing petty crime, and providing a positive outlet and motivation for young people who might otherwise have sedentary lifestyles.
An argument for incentivizing volunteering, long working hours.
A sample agrees that the economic success often associated with long hours comes at a social cost, negatively impacting family life and personal health.
Preserving old buildings.
A sample presents the dilemma.
Hmm.
Demolish them because they take up space or are unfit versus preserving them for their identity, potential use, or tourist value.
Yeah.
That sample offers a conditional view. Demolishes only if they occupy significant space and are unfit. Otherwise, preserve them, acknowledging maintenance is needed.
A qualified position. What if people didn't have to work? Would they choose not to?
A sample disagrees with the idea that people wouldn't work if given the choice. It argues work actually saves us from boredom and provides purpose.
Job satisfaction versus job security.
A sample discusses both sides. Job satisfaction is presented as potentially temporary, maybe leading to less ambition. Job security is highlighted as allowing employees to focus and dedicate energy without fear of being fired. It presents the trade-offs.
When should children start school? Very early or later, around age 7.
The sample supports starting later, around 7. Arguments presented are the importance of childhood play and communication for development, that basic life qualities aren't necessarily gained from early formal study, and that starting later allows more parent-child interaction time.
And finally, the concept of an ideal society.
One sample tackles this by arguing a truly ideal society is actually not possible. The reason given is that some level of social inequality or differences in ability seems necessary or inherent. While it might mention ways to improve society, its core argument reported is the impossibility of a perfect utopia.
Okay, wow, that's a huge range of topics and arguments presented in those sample essays.
It really shows the flexibility of the essay structure to tackle different kinds of questions, discussing, arguing, evaluating, proposing solutions.
And the key takeaways seem consistent. Plan your essay, have a clear structure, intro, body paragraphs with main ideas and support, conclusion. Use linking words for flow. Employ varied vocabulary and sentence structures, ensure accuracy, and focus on logical arguments with support, even if the ideas aren't earth-shattering.
That sums it up well based on the sources.
All right, let's touch briefly on the third type of writing covered. Letters. These seem much more practical and direct.
Yes, definitely more about specific, often immediate, real-world tasks. As we noted, the sources usually frame these as shorter tasks, maybe 150 words minimum, done in about 20 minutes.
And the crucial thing here, compared to maybe essays or data reports, is tailoring it to the audience, right? Formal versus informal.
Absolutely critical. The sources show examples of formal letters, maybe to a company, a landlord, someone you don't know well, where you'd use titles like Mr., Mrs., Miss, and a more formal tone.
Like the sample letter of complaint about a hotel experience, or one explaining why you can't attend an interview, or asking a hotel about a lost bag.
Exactly. And then there are informal letters to friends or family, where you'd use first names and a much more relaxed conversational tone.
Like the samples congratulating a friend, asking for advice about university or a vacation, or asking a friend to help find a job.
Right. The purpose and your relationship with the recipient dictate the tone, the language, even the content.
Do the sources suggest a particular structure for letters, even with this variety?
They generally follow the standard letter format. A greeting, appropriate to formal, informal, the main body, and a closing, again, appropriate. Within the body, the principle of having a clear purpose stated early, followed by necessary details or explanations, still applies.
So even in a simple letter, clarity and structure matter.
Yes. For example, the sample complaint letter about a leaky sink clearly states the problem, explains the issue it's causing, suggests what needs to be done, and asks for a visit. Very direct and structured.
And the one asking a friend for job help explains why they need help, describes the kind of job they want, and then makes the specific request.
Purpose, context, request. Clear steps. So yeah, even for practical letters, knowing your goal, your audience, and organizing your points logically is key, according to these materials.
Okay, so we've looked at describing data, crafting essays, and writing letters. It seems like underneath these different forms, the sources keep coming back to some fundamental tools for any kind of effective writing.
They really do. Concepts like coherence and cohesion appear frequently, especially in checklists or guides.
Remind us what those mean again.
Coherence is about the overall clarity and logical organization of your ideas. Does it make sense? Is it easy to follow? Cohesion is more about how you connect those ideas together smoothly at the sentence and paragraph level. Do the pieces link up well?
And that's where those linking words we talked about for essays come in again.
Exactly. Transition words and phrases are crucial tools for creating cohesion, making the text flow rather than feeling like a list of disconnected sentences.
Vocabulary and sentence structure also keep coming up.
Yes, the need for a good range of vocabulary lexical resource, as it's sometimes called, to express yourself precisely and avoid repetition. And using varied sentence structures, mixing short and long, simple and complex, to make the writing more dynamic and engaging.
And the absolute baseline, accuracy.
Can't escape it. Correct grammar, spelling, and punctuation are essential for clarity and credibility.
Yeah.
Mistakes can really get in the way of your message. The sources specifically mention checking these, and even list grammar points like prepositions, active-passive voice, parallel structure, conditionals, adjective clauses as areas to be aware of.
And one very practical piece of advice from the sources is actually using a revision checklist.
Yeah, some provide checklists covering things like, did you fully answer the question? Is it well organized? Coherence. Do the ideas link well? Cohesion. Is the vocabulary varied and appropriate? Is the grammar accurate? It turns revision into a systematic check rather than just vaguely rereading.
That seems like a really useful takeaway.
Definitely. It reinforces that good writing often involves conscious checking and refinement.
So wrapping this all up, we've really journeyed through these source materials, haven't we? We've explored the very specific techniques for objectively describing visual data.
Looking at trends, comparisons, sequences, and the precise language needed for that.
Then we shifted to the more subjective world of essays, examining structures for different prompts, discussing views, arguing a point, analyzing problems and solutions, and the importance of logical support, linking words, and clear expression.
And we touched on the practicalities of letter writing, adapting tone and content for different audiences and purposes.
And throughout it all, we saw these recurring themes: the need for clear structure, logical flow, appropriate vocabulary, varied sentences, and fundamental accuracy.
These seem to be the building blocks of effective written communication, highlighted across all these different tasks in the source materials.
And the real value here for you, listening, isn't just about maybe having to write these things yourself one day. It's also about becoming a more critical and informed reader or consumer of information.
Absolutely. When you understand the typical structure of a data report, you know where to look for the main findings. When you read an opinion piece, you can identify the main arguments and the supporting evidence or lack thereof.
You can recognize the techniques being used. You know that a description of a chart should be objective based only on the data, while an essay is likely presenting a specific viewpoint or argument.
Knowing the rules of the game for different communication forms helps you navigate them much more effectively. It helps you decode the messages you receive every day.
Which leads us to a final thought, something to maybe mull over. We saw this stark contrast between the task of describing data, where objectivity is paramount and personal input is forbidden, and writing an essay, where developing an argument or exploring opinions is often the entire point.
A real difference in purpose.
So how much does the form itself dictate the message? How does knowing whether something is presented as an objective report versus a persuasive essay change how we should approach it, how we interpret the information, and maybe even how much we trust it? Does the structure itself shape our perception even before we dive into the content?
And related to that, how much power lies in mastering those seemingly tiny details? The sources emphasized the right preposition, the perfect transition word, the varied sentence structure. How much impact can those technical skills have on the clarity, the persuasiveness, and the overall effectiveness of communication, whether you're aiming for objective reporting or compelling argumentation? Something to think about as we all navigate and contribute to the complex world of information around us